This message does not arrive while the old timeline is still in charge. It does not reach you when its authority feels unquestionable or when its logic still organizes your decisions. It appears only after something quieter has already shifted. You may not remember when that shift happened. There was no announcement, no internal milestone, no moment where you declared yourself finished, and yet the authority that once guided your reactions no longer carries the same weight. The old timeline can still speak, but it no longer commands. It can still suggest urgency, but the body does not respond the same way. This message finds you in that gap, not because you were looking for it, but because you are no longer being pulled elsewhere with the same force. It does not introduce a new idea. It confirms a loss of influence. Something that once organized your sense of direction has quietly stepped down. And what remains is not confusion, but a neutral clarity that does not need reinforcement. This message is not meant to move you. It is meant to meet you where movement has already slowed. The state you are in may feel understated compared to what you expected change to feel like. There is no rush of certainty, no excitement about what comes next. Instead, there is a steadiness that does not ask to be interpreted. You might notice that situations still unfold, decisions still appear, and the mind still generates commentary, but none of it positions itself as final authority. You are no longer oriented by the same internal pressure to respond correctly, quickly, or meaningfully. The old timeline relied on that pressure to maintain its role. It framed itself as necessary. It made urgency feel like truth. Now, urgency appears without credibility. It shows up and fades without being obeyed. That is the loss of authority. Not disappearance, but demotion. You are still aware of the old signals, but they no longer define your posture. This is why the message can land without resistance. There is space for it, because the system is no longer crowded by directives. It does not ask you to adopt a new framework. It recognizes that the framework you were operating under has already loosened. And in that loosening, a different kind of stability has begun to take shape. Before this shift, authority lived in subtle places. It was not always loud or obvious. It showed up as a feeling that certain thoughts had to be taken seriously, that certain reactions were justified by default, that certain timelines deserved continued investment simply because they had been active for so long. You may have experienced this as responsibility, intuition, or staying aligned. The old timeline did not demand belief. It demanded attention. It trained you to keep checking, adjusting, interpreting, and correcting in order to feel oriented. Even moments of rest carried a background tension, as if something important might be missed if you disengaged for too long. That was authority in practice. It did not need to declare itself, it was assumed. And because it was assumed, it shaped your posture toward the world. You leaned toward outcomes. You leaned toward resolution. You leaned toward the idea that the next response mattered more than your current state. When that leaning stopped, not through effort but through exhaustion of usefulness, authority dissolved. Not dramatically, quietly. The old timeline did not lose because it was challenged. It lost because it no longer organized your attention in a way that felt necessary. What replaces that authority is not a new command structure. There is no alternative voice stepping in to guide you. There is simply a redistribution of weight. Thoughts still appear, but they do not arrive with the same gravity. Decisions still happen, but they do not frame themselves as identity statements. You act when action is required and pause when it is not, without narrating either one as progress or failure. This is where many people expect a gap to feel uncomfortable. They expect uncertainty to rush in and demand explanation. Instead, the gap holds. It holds because nothing is trying to fill it. The system has already adjusted to operating without constant instruction. That is why the old timeline cannot regain authority through doubt or nostalgia. It can present familiar arguments, but they land in a field that no longer amplifies them. Authority depended on amplification. It needed you to echo its urgency internally. Without that echo, its voice fades into background noise. And in that quieter field, this message can exist without competing for attention. It does not need to persuade you. It is simply describing what is already functioning. You can observe this loss of authority in small, practical moments where the old structure used to intervene. A situation presents itself, and there is no immediate internal debate about the correct way to handle it. You respond or you do not, and either option feels complete on its own. The familiar urge to optimize your response, to preempt consequences, to manage how the moment will be remembered, does not fully activate. It is not suppressed. It simply does not arrive with force. This is the micro-progression. Authority fades not in dramatic decisions, but in the disappearance of inner escalation. The mind still offers interpretations, but they feel optional. You can take them or leave them without consequence. The old timeline once relied on your quick agreement with those interpretations to stay in charge. When agreement becomes optional, authority weakens. You might notice that your attention stays closer to what is actually happening rather than what it might mean later. This is not mindfulness as a practice. It is attention no longer being pulled forward by obligation. The system has learned quietly that it can function without constant supervision, and that learning shows up as ease in the ordinary. In daily life, this looks almost unremarkable. You read a message, and you do not immediately assign it a deeper meaning. You hear news, and it does not reorganize your internal state. You move through routines without feeling like they are placeholders for something more important that has not arrived yet. Even when uncertainty appears, it does not rush to define itself. It stays open without demanding closure. The old timeline used to hook you through these moments. It framed them as signals that required interpretation. Now they pass without being promoted to authority. You are not disengaged, you are simply not recruited. This is why the change can be difficult to explain to someone else. From the outside, very little looks different. From the inside, the hierarchy has shifted. What once commanded now suggests. What once pressured now waits. And because nothing is rushing you, the message you are hearing does not need to compete with internal noise. It arrives into a system that already knows how to listen without immediately reacting. That is the condition under which this message can be received. There is a subtle temptation at this point to look for a conclusion that would make this loss of authority feel complete. The old habit wants a statement, a realization, a sentence you could repeat to yourself to confirm that something has ended. But the state you are in does not resolve itself through language. It stabilizes through lack of interference. The quiet you are experiencing is not waiting to be named correctly, it is already functioning without your commentary. You may notice stretches of time where nothing in you is monitoring your state, checking whether you are still aligned, or wondering if you are doing this right. Those stretches used to feel unsafe. Now they feel ordinary. That ordinariness is important. It means the system is no longer scanning for authority to replace what was lost. It is not looking for a new framework to follow. It is learning how to remain without supervision. The old timeline cannot return through understanding, because understanding is no longer the gatekeeper. Presence does not need approval, and as long as you do not interrupt this by trying to finalize it, it continues on its own, quietly, without effort. The mind still participates, but in a different role. It no longer positions itself as the narrator of what is happening. It becomes more like background texture. Thoughts come and go without insisting on relevance. You might notice that when a familiar storyline appears, one that once carried authority, it now feels slightly out of sync with your current state. Not wrong, just unnecessary. You can let the thought pass without correcting it or following it. This is not discipline. It is a change in relationship. The mind offers content, but the system does not automatically treat that content as instruction. Authority used to be granted instantly. Now it is not granted at all. And without authority, the old timeline cannot reassert itself through memory, projection, or self-analysis. It can still appear, but it cannot organize your behavior. That is why this message can continue to land without friction. It is not adding anything to your understanding. It is simply moving through a space that is no longer governed by the old rules. There may still be moments when the old authority tries to test its position indirectly, not by commanding, but by questioning. It can sound subtle. What if this is just passivity? What if you are disengaging instead of evolving? What if something important requires more effort than you are giving? These questions used to carry weight because they implied responsibility. They suggested that vigilance was proof of care. Now they arise and remain unanswered without creating tension. You can feel how they would have pulled you into self-correction before, and you can also feel how little momentum they generate now. The questions arrive, pause briefly, and then dissolve because nothing inside you rushes to respond. This is the controlled tension in this phase. The mind checks whether authority still exists by offering doubt as a hook, but doubt cannot function without urgency. And urgency no longer has credibility. The system has already learned that it can remain coherent without constantly proving itself. That is why the old timeline cannot reclaim its role through uncertainty. The absence of response is not avoidance. It is completion operating quietly. This shift is reflected in the body before it becomes clear in thought. The old authority lived as readiness, a subtle tightening, a forward lean, a sense that you should be preparing for the next adjustment. Now that readiness relaxes, the body does not brace when uncertainty appears. Breathing stays even, attention stays local. You can feel that the system is no longer mobilizing around imagined demands. Even when action is required, it does not arrive with the same internal compression. You move when movement is needed and rest when it is not, without framing either one as a test. This matters because authority once operated through the nervous system first. It trained the body to respond before the mind could question. With that pathway quieted, the old timeline loses its most effective leverage. It cannot hook you through reflex anymore. The future does not pull on you through the body. The past does not tense you into return. What remains is a system that is already regulated enough to stay where it is. And in that regulation, authority does not need to be replaced. It simply remains absent. You can see how complete this loss of authority is in the lack of aftermath it leaves behind. Situations unfold and then they end. Conversations finish without continuing internally. Decisions are made without being reviewed repeatedly for correctness. The old timeline relied on residue to stay relevant. It needed you to carry moments forward so they could be re-examined, improved, or corrected later. Now that carrying stops, not because you are trying to be present, but because the system no longer assigns value to internal replay. Even when something is unresolved externally, it does not remain unresolved inside you in the same way. There is a clean break between experience and identity. What happens, happens. It does not automatically become a commentary on who you are or where you are going. This is one of the clearest indicators that authority has shifted. When the internal echo quiets, the old timeline has nothing left to amplify. Without amplification, it fades into irrelevance. And in that quieter field, what remains feels stable rather than empty. Nothing new needs to be added to stabilize this state. There is no replacement belief, no upgraded narrative, no framework waiting to take over. That absence is intentional. The system has learned how to function without being oriented by explanation. You move through days without needing to frame them as steps in a process. You are not tracking progress or waiting for confirmation that you are on the right path. The absence of authority does not create chaos. It creates simplicity. The old timeline loses relevance not because it is rejected, but because it is no longer consulted. You are not actively letting go. You're already no longer holding on. This is slow resonance. It holds itself without effort. And because nothing is being forced, nothing needs to be defended. The message continues to land not as guidance, but as recognition. It does not lead you forward. It stays with you where you already are. Time reorganizes itself around this loss of authority, not externally, but internally. The old timeline used time to pressure you into relevance. It made you feel late, behind, or on the verge of missing something essential. Waiting felt charged. Pauses felt dangerous. Now time moves without that internal compression. You can wait without interpreting waiting as failure. You can be between moments without assuming something is wrong. Days pass without being measured against an internal standard that demands progress. This is not resignation. It is neutrality returning to time itself. The future no longer pulls you forward as a place where authority will be restored. The past no longer pulls you backward as something that still needs resolution. And because neither direction carries weight, the present is no longer squeezed. It has room to exist without commentary. This is another reason the old timeline cannot regain authority. It depended on urgency created by time pressure. Without that pressure, its logic collapses quietly. As urgency fades, identity simplifies. The version of you that needed authority was a version that stayed defined through constant orientation. Who am I in this moment? What does this mean about me? Where am I headed now? Those questions once felt necessary. Now they arise less often, and when they do not demand answers. You can function without continuously narrating yourself. You can act without framing the action as proof of growth or decline. The self becomes quieter, not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs to be reinforced through reaction. This is not detachment. It is identity, no longer being held together by tension. The old timeline cannot hook you through self-definition anymore because self-definition is no longer the primary reference. You are not trying to be someone specific in order to be valid. You are simply operating from where you are. And that simplicity removes one of the last places authority used to hide. This is how integration looks when it is no longer trying to prove itself. Life becomes ordinary in a way that feels reliable rather than flat. You still encounter complexity, emotion, and unpredictability, but none of it needs to be elevated into a defining event. The system does not search for meaning in every fluctuation. It responds where response is needed and moves on where it is not. The absence of authority distributes itself across small moments. You notice it in how quickly situations complete, in how little explanation is required, in how rarely you feel pulled to check whether you are doing this correctly. The old timeline depended on intensity to stay believable. It needed urgency to feel real. Without urgency, it fades naturally. And what replaces it is not a new structure, but a steady functioning that does not call attention to itself. This is why the change can feel underwhelming if you expect transformation to announce itself. Integration does not arrive as a peak. It arrives as consistency. It is visible in how little effort it takes to stay where you are. There is no final directive attached to this message. It does not ask you to commit to anything or to carry this forward intentionally. If you recognize yourself in what was described, that recognition is already complete. The old timeline has lost authority because it no longer organizes your attention, your body, or your sense of time. Nothing needs to replace it. You do not need to guard this state or interpret it for it to remain stable. You can let thoughts appear without obeying them. You can let moments pass without extracting meaning from them. You can let life continue without using it to prove anything. This message does not close with a promise because nothing is opening. It closes by remaining where it is, and from here nothing needs to be done.